My name is Danielle Turner. I'm 31 years old, and I just discovered that my gambling-addicted brother sold my entire $650,000 vintage comic book collection to pay his debts, then had the audacity to laugh in my face when I confronted him in tears, saying, "They're just stupid books. At least now they're doing something useful instead of collecting dust." What Marcus didn't know was that his cruel dismissal of 20 years of my life's work was about to trigger the most comprehensive and devastating legal revenge in comic book theft history, one that would cost him far more than he could have ever imagined possible. The moment I walked into my climate-controlled storage room and saw nothing but empty shelves where my life's greatest achievement had once been displayed, I felt something break inside me that I knew would never heal the same way again. For 20 years, I had carefully curated what experts considered one of the world's finest private vintage comic book collections, featuring first-edition Marvel and DC classics that represented not just monetary value, but decades of passionate research, strategic purchasing, and meticulous preservation. My collection wasn't just a hobby. It was a testament to dedication, patience, and deep appreciation for the art form that had shaped American popular culture for generations. I owned Amazing Fantasy The AR-15, the first appearance of Spider-Man, in near-mint condition worth $85,000. My Action Comics #1, featuring Superman's debut, was graded 9.2 by CGC and valued at $120,000. The Incredible Hulk #1, X-Men #1, Fantastic Four #1, and dozens of other key issues represented the foundation of modern superhero mythology. But beyond the monetary value was the emotional investment that no insurance policy could replace. Each comic had been acquired through years of research, careful negotiation, and sometimes waiting decades for the right copy to become available. I had traveled across the country to comic conventions, built relationships with dealers and collectors, and spent countless hours learning about grading, restoration detection, and market trends. Every comic was stored in archival quality bags and boards, organized in custom-built storage boxes, and maintained in a climate-controlled environment that kept temperature and humidity at optimal levels for preservation. I had detailed documentation of every purchase, including provenance records, grading certificates, and photographs that tracked the condition of each issue over time. My storage room was more than just a place to keep comics. It was my sanctuary, my museum, my legacy. The walls were lined with UV protective display cases showcasing rotating selections from my collection, while the majority of comics were stored in precision-engineered cabinets that protected them from light, moisture, and temperature fluctuations. Standing in that empty room, looking at the vacant shelves and open storage boxes that had been carelessly tossed aside, I felt like I was standing in a cemetery where every gravestone had been desecrated. 20 years of passion, research, and careful acquisition had vanished, leaving nothing but empty space and the crushing realization that someone I trusted had destroyed the thing I valued most in the world. The security system logs showed that Marcus had used his emergency key to enter my storage unit 3 days earlier while I was at a business conference in Denver. He had spent over 6 hours systematically removing every comic from my collection, loading them into boxes, and transporting them to whatever buyers he had found for quick cash sales. The methodical nature of the theft made it even more heartbreaking. This wasn't an impulsive decision made in desperation. It was a calculated crime that required planning, transportation, and multiple trips to remove everything from my carefully organized collection. Marcus had looked at 20 years of my life's work and seen nothing but dollar signs that could solve his immediate gambling problems. My hands were shaking as I called Marcus's phone, hoping against hope that there had been some terrible misunderstanding, that my comics were safe somewhere, and this was all just a nightmare I would wake up from. The phone rang 4 times before his familiar voice answered with casual indifference that made my blood run cold. "Hey, Danielle. What's up?" Marcus said, his tone so normal and cheerful that for a moment I wondered if I had made a mistake. If maybe someone else had somehow accessed my storage room and stolen my collection. "Marcus," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "My storage room is empty. All of my comics are gone. Do you know anything about this?" The pause that followed was long enough to confirm my worst fears before Marcus even spoke. When he finally responded, his voice had shifted from casual friendliness to defensive irritation, as if I was bothering him with an inconvenient question about something trivial. "Oh yeah, that," he said dismissively. "I sold them. I needed the money to pay off some debts, and you weren't using them anyway. They were just sitting there collecting dust." The casual way he admitted to stealing and selling my life's greatest achievement was so shocking that I couldn't initially process what he was telling me. He was talking about the theft of $650,000 worth of irreplaceable collectibles, as if he had borrowed $20 without asking. "You sold them?" I repeated, still not believing what I was hearing. "Marcus, those comics were worth over $600,000. They represented 20 years of collecting." "How could you just sell them without asking me?" "600,000?" Marcus laughed. Actually laughed, as if the value of my collection was the funniest thing he had ever heard. "Danielle, they're comic books. They're just stupid books with pictures in them. I got enough money to pay my debts and take care of some other things. At least now they're doing something useful instead of just sitting in your weird little shrine." Have you ever had someone you trusted completely dismiss something you love as worthless while simultaneously stealing it from you? That's exactly what I experienced, as Marcus laughed at my devastation while justifying his theft as doing me a favor by putting my stupid books to useful purposes. "Marcus," I said, my voice rising with emotion I couldn't control, "those weren't just comic books. That was my collection. I spent 20 years building it. Some of those comics were worth $50,000 each. You can't just sell other people's property because you need money." "Calm down, Danielle," Marcus replied, his voice becoming more annoyed as he realized I wasn't going to be reasonable about his theft. "They're just comics. You're 31 years old. Don't you think it's time to grow up and stop playing with kid stuff? I did you a favor by getting rid of all that clutter." The characterization of my passion and expertise as kid stuff and clutter was devastating, but it was also revealing about how Marcus viewed not just my collection, but me as a person. He saw my dedication and success in building something valuable as childishness that needed to be corrected by his adult decision to steal and liquidate my assets. "Where did you sell them?" I asked, hoping that maybe I could track down the buyers and somehow recover at least some of my most valuable pieces. "Maybe I can contact the buyers and explain that those comics were stolen property." "I sold them to different people," Marcus said evasively. "Comic book stores, collectors, some guy I found online. I got good prices for them, probably more than they were actually worth. And they're not stolen property. You're my sister, and family helps family when they're in trouble." The legal and ethical confusion in his statement was breathtaking. He was simultaneously claiming that he got good prices while dismissing the comics as worthless, and he was justifying theft by redefining our family relationship as giving him ownership rights to my property. "Marcus, taking someone's property without permission and selling it is theft, even if we're related," I explained, though I could tell from his tone that he wasn't interested in understanding the legal or moral problems with his actions. "Those comics belong to me. You had no right to sell them, regardless of your financial situation." "Look, Danielle," Marcus said, his voice becoming more aggressive as he realized I wasn't going to simply accept his theft and move on. I had some serious debts that needed to be paid. These weren't friendly loans. These were dangerous people who don't accept excuses. Your comic books were just sitting there not doing anything while I was dealing with real problems that could affect my safety. The revelation that he had been involved with dangerous creditors added another layer of concern to an already devastating situation. Not only had he stolen my life's work, but he had done so to solve problems created by his own irresponsible gambling behavior. "So you stole my property to pay gambling debts?" I asked, wanting to make sure I understood the full scope of his betrayal. "You destroyed 20 years of my collecting to bail yourself out of consequences from your own poor decisions?" "It's not stealing when it's family," Marcus replied, a statement so legally and morally wrong that I wondered if he actually believed it, or if he was just trying to convince himself that his crime was acceptable. And yes, I had gambling debts, but I also had other expenses. I used some of the money to take a vacation to Vegas. I needed to clear my head and have some fun after all the stress I've been under. The fact that he had used proceeds from my stolen comics to fund a gambling trip to Las Vegas was so outrageously inappropriate that I initially thought he must be joking, but his matter-of-fact tone made it clear that he saw nothing wrong with stealing my property to fund his entertainment while I dealt with the devastating loss of my collection. "You used my money to go gambling in Las Vegas?" I asked, my voice rising with incredulous anger. "Marcus, you stole my comics to pay gambling debts, then used the leftover money to go gambling again?" "I didn't go there just to gamble," Marcus said defensively, though his tone suggested that gambling had indeed been a major part of his Las Vegas vacation. "I needed to get away from all the stress and pressure I've been under. You should be happy that I was finally able to take care of my problems and enjoy myself a little bit." The conversation ended with Marcus becoming increasingly hostile about my overreaction to what he characterized as a family member helping him solve serious problems. He refused to provide specific information about who had purchased my comics or whether any of them might still be recoverable. As I stood in my empty storage room after hanging up the phone, I realized that this wasn't just theft. It was the destruction of my identity and passion by someone who saw my greatest achievement as disposable assets that could solve his immediate problems. But what Marcus didn't understand was that my expertise in comic book collecting had given me knowledge and connections that would make his crime far more expensive than he had ever imagined possible. The devastation I felt after discovering the theft of my comic book collection was unlike anything I had ever experienced, but it was nothing compared to the emotional abuse I endured when I tried to get support from my family during the most difficult period of my life. My parents, Beverly and Raymond Turner, along with my extended family, not only refused to acknowledge the seriousness of Marcus's crime, but actually defended his theft while treating my devastation as unreasonable overreaction to material possessions. The depth of my passion for comic book collecting had developed over 2 decades, beginning when I was 11 years old and discovered a box of vintage comics in my grandfather's attic. Those comics, published in the 1960s and 1970s, introduced me to the rich storytelling and artistic craftsmanship that defined the golden and silver ages of comic book publishing. My grandfather, Robert Turner, had been a collector himself during his youth, and he recognized my genuine interest in the stories and artwork rather than just their potential value. He taught me how to handle comics properly, how to identify different artists and writers, and how to appreciate the cultural significance of these publications that had influenced generations of readers. "Comics aren't just entertainment, Danielle," Grandpa Robert had told me during one of our many afternoons spent examining his collection. "They're historical documents that show us how American culture evolved through different decades. These stories reflect our hopes, fears, and dreams during some of the most important periods in our history." Under his guidance, I learned to see comic books as legitimate art forms that combined visual storytelling with literary narrative in ways that were unique and powerful. I studied the work of legendary creators like Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, and John Byrne, understanding how their innovations had shaped not just comics, but all of popular culture. When my grandfather passed away during my sophomore year of college, he left his modest collection to me, along with advice that would guide my collecting philosophy for the next 2 decades. Only buy what you love, take care of what you own, and never let anyone convince you that your passion isn't valuable just because they don't understand it. I took his advice seriously, developing expertise in comic book grading, market trends, and authentication that allowed me to make intelligent purchasing decisions rather than simply buying whatever was expensive or popular. I learned to identify restored comics, to spot reprints and counterfeits, and to understand the subtle differences in condition that could affect a comic's value by tens of thousands of dollars. My collection grew methodically over the years, with each acquisition representing careful research and strategic planning rather than impulsive purchasing. I would spend months researching specific issues, tracking market prices, and waiting for the right copy to become available at a price I could afford. The process of building my collection had taught me patience, discipline, and attention to detail that served me well in other areas of my life. My career as a project manager for a software development company benefited from the same organizational skills and long-term planning abilities that I used in collecting comics. But my family had never understood or appreciated the depth of my knowledge and dedication. To them, comics were childish entertainment that I should have outgrown years ago. They saw my collection as an expensive hobby rather than recognizing it as a legitimate passion that had taught me valuable skills and connected me to a community of knowledgeable collectors and enthusiasts. Marcus, in particular, had always been dismissive and contemptuous of my interest in comics. During family gatherings, he would make jokes about my nerdy obsession and suggest that I was wasting money on kid stuff instead of investing in more adult pursuits like his gambling and nightlife activities. "Danielle still thinks she's 12 years old," Marcus would say during family dinners, usually after drinking enough to make his comments especially cruel. "She spends thousands of dollars on picture books while the rest of us are dealing with real adult responsibilities." The irony of Marcus lecturing anyone about adult responsibilities while accumulating gambling debts and borrowing money from family members was lost on everyone except me. But challenging his criticisms would only result in family lectures about being more supportive of my brother and not taking his teasing so seriously. My parents' attitude toward my collecting was more passive, but equally dismissive. They saw it as an expensive hobby that I could afford because I was single and had no children, rather than recognizing it as a serious pursuit that required expertise and provided genuine satisfaction and personal growth. "It's nice that Danielle has a hobby," my mother would say when extended family members asked about my collection, "but I worry that she's too focused on material things instead of building relationships and thinking about starting a family." The assumption that my passion for collecting meant I was neglecting other areas of my life was both wrong and hurtful. I had meaningful friendships, a successful career, and a rich social life that included regular attendance at comic conventions, collector meetups, and cultural events. My interest in comics had actually expanded my social circle and provided me with connections to interesting people who shared my appreciation for art and storytelling. But my family's narrow definition of acceptable adult interests didn't include space for passions that they didn't understand or value. They wanted me to be more like Marcus, focused on conventional pursuits like dating, marriage, and traditional entertainment, even though Marcus's conventional pursuits had led to gambling addiction and financial irresponsibility. The morning after I discovered the theft of my collection, I drove to my parents' house, hoping to get emotional support and help in dealing with Marcus's crime. I was devastated, exhausted from a sleepless night, and desperate for family members who would understand the magnitude of what had been taken from me. "Mom, Dad," I said, as I sat in their living room, still in shock from the previous day's discovery. "I need to tell you about something terrible that happened. Marcus stole my entire comic book collection while I was out of town. Everything is gone. 20 years of collecting, over $600,000 worth of comics. I expected outrage, sympathy, and immediate offers to help me deal with this crisis. Instead, I received responses that made me feel more alone and misunderstood than I had ever felt in my life." "Oh, honey," my mother said, her voice filled with what sounded like relief rather than concern. "I'm sure Marcus had a good reason for taking those comics. He's been under so much stress with his financial problems. Maybe this was his way of finally taking responsibility for his debts." "Taking responsibility?" I repeated, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Mom, he stole my property and sold it without permission." "That's not taking responsibility. That's committing a crime to avoid taking responsibility." My father's response was even worse. "Danielle, you know Marcus has been struggling with some serious financial issues," Raymond said, in the tone he used when he wanted to end discussions about uncomfortable topics. "If those comics helped him get back on his feet and pay his debts, then maybe some good came out of the situation. You can always start collecting again." The casual dismissal of 20 years of my life's work as something I could simply start collecting again revealed how little my family understood about what had been taken from me. They were treating the theft of irreplaceable collectibles worth more than most people's homes, as if Marcus had borrowed some books from my personal library. "Dad, those comics can't be replaced," I explained, trying to help him understand the magnitude of the loss. Some of them were one-of-a-kind items in specific grades and conditions. It would take decades to rebuild the collection, assuming I could even find comparable copies, which is unlikely. "Danielle, they're comic books," my mother said, her patience clearly wearing thin with what she saw as my overreaction to a reasonable solution to Marcus's problems. I know you enjoyed collecting them, but family is more important than material possessions. Marcus needed help, and your comics provided that help. Have you ever tried to explain the destruction of your greatest passion to people who saw that destruction as a favor? That's exactly what I experienced as my parents characterized Marcus's theft as family cooperation, rather than recognizing it as a serious crime that had devastated my life. This isn't about material possessions, I said, my voice rising with frustration at their complete failure to understand what had happened. This is about 20 years of research, dedication, and careful collecting. This is about Marcus committing theft and then laughing about it when I confronted him. Marcus laughed? My father asked, his tone suggesting that he found this detail amusing rather than concerning. Well, you know how Marcus is. He probably didn't realize how upset you would be. He's always been more practical about money than sentimental about possessions. The characterization of theft and cruelty as practical thinking was so morally backwards that I wondered if my parents had any understanding of right and wrong when it came to Marcus's behavior. They were defending crime and emotional abuse as personality traits that I should accept and accommodate. The conversation continued for over an hour, with my parents consistently defending Marcus while minimizing the seriousness of his theft and my legitimate emotional response to losing everything I had worked to build. They suggested that I was being materialistic and unforgiving by not immediately accepting that my loss was worthwhile if it helped Marcus solve his gambling problems. By the time I left their house that afternoon, I understood that I would receive no support from my family in dealing with Marcus's crime or its emotional impact on my life. They had chosen to protect Marcus from consequences while treating me as if my devastation was unreasonable and my loss was acceptable collateral damage in solving his problems. But what they didn't understand was that their betrayal had given me the clarity and motivation I needed to pursue justice through legal channels, rather than hoping for family support and understanding. Marcus's theft would have consequences that none of them had anticipated, and their dismissal of my loss would make those consequences even more comprehensive and devastating. The cruelest aspect of my family's response to Marcus's theft wasn't just their initial dismissal of my loss, but their ongoing expectation that I should participate in family gatherings and act as if nothing had happened while Marcus celebrated his improved financial situation, and everyone else pretended that stealing my life's work had been a reasonable solution to his gambling debts. The first Sunday dinner after the theft was the most emotionally brutal experience of my adult life. I arrived at my parents' house hoping that maybe a few days of reflection had helped them understand the seriousness of what Marcus had done and the impact it had on me. Instead, I found Marcus sitting at the dinner table looking relaxed and satisfied, clearly enjoying his debt-free status and the family's approval of his responsible approach to financial problems. "Danielle," Marcus said cheerfully as I walked into the dining room, his tone suggesting that we were simply continuing normal family interactions, rather than addressing the fact that he had committed a felony against me less than a week earlier. "How was your week? I hope you're feeling better about everything." The casual way he referenced everything, as if the theft of my 20-year collection was a minor disagreement we had moved past, was breathtaking in its audacity. He was acting like the victim who was graciously offering forgiveness for my unreasonable reaction to his reasonable actions. "I'm not feeling better about having my entire collection stolen," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the rage I felt at his cheerful demeanor. $600,000 worth of irreplaceable comics don't stop being stolen just because a week has passed. "Oh, Danielle," my mother interrupted from the kitchen. "Please don't start that again. Marcus took care of his debts, and that's what matters. You can't keep dwelling on material things when your brother finally got his life together." The reframing of theft as taking care of debts and my grief as dwelling on material things revealed how completely my family had convinced themselves that Marcus's crime was actually a positive development that I was selfishly refusing to celebrate. Marcus leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smile that made my skin crawl. "You know, Danielle, cleaning up all that clutter from your storage room was actually pretty therapeutic. I felt like I was helping you get rid of stuff you didn't really need anyway. Most of those comics were just duplicates or weird titles nobody cares about." The characterization of my carefully curated collection as clutter and duplicates showed how little Marcus understood about what he had stolen. I didn't own duplicates. Every comic in my collection had been selected for specific reasons related to its historical significance, artistic merit, or market value. They weren't duplicates, I said, trying to correct his deliberate mischaracterization of my collection. Every comic was chosen specifically for its importance. You sold first edition appearances of major characters, key storylines, and comics by legendary creators. Whatever, Marcus replied dismissively, reaching for more food as if discussing the weather, rather than the destruction of my passion. The important thing is that they finally did something useful instead of just sitting there making you look like a hoarder. My father nodded approvingly at Marcus's comment. Marcus has a point, Danielle. You had been accumulating those comics for 20 years without really doing anything with them. At least now they help solve a real problem instead of just taking up space. The failure to understand that preservation and collecting were valuable activities in themselves revealed how little my family respected expertise or dedication that didn't result in immediate practical benefits. They saw my collection as worthless because it wasn't generating daily income, ignoring the fact that it had increased in value by hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. Dad, those comics were an investment that had grown to be worth more than most people's retirement savings, I explained, hoping that framing it in financial terms might help him understand the magnitude of the loss. Marcus destroyed 20 years of careful investing and threw away hundreds of thousands in appreciation. But Danielle, my mother said as she brought food to the table, you never planned to sell those comics anyway, so their value didn't really matter. Marcus needed real money for real problems, not theoretical money that was locked up in old magazines. The ignorance in her statement was staggering. Comic books weren't old magazines. They were collectibles with established markets and expert appraisals. And calling my collection's value theoretical ignored the fact that Marcus had converted that value into real money when he stole and sold my property. Marcus was clearly enjoying the family support for his theft and my isolation in opposing it. Plus, Danielle, I have to say that your storage room looks so much better now that it's cleaned out. Maybe you could use it for something more practical, like actual adult storage needs. Like what? I asked, curious to hear what Marcus considered more adult than maintaining a collection worth more than most people's cars. I don't know, Marcus said with a shrug. Holiday decorations, old furniture, normal stuff that families keep in storage, not fantasy books about guys in capes flying around. The dismissal of comic books as fantasy books about guys in capes revealed Marcus's complete ignorance about the medium he had stolen from me. My collection included horror comics, war comics, romance comics, and experimental graphic novels that represented the full range of storytelling possibilities within the medium. But trying to educate Marcus about the diversity and sophistication of comic book art would be pointless when he had already demonstrated that he saw my passion as childish nonsense that deserved to be eliminated from my life for my own good. Marcus, you stole and sold property that didn't belong to you, I said, trying once more to get my family to acknowledge the basic legal and moral facts of the situation. That's theft, regardless of what you think about comic books or how you use the money. It's not theft when it's family helping family, Marcus replied, using the same legally meaningless justification he had used during our phone conversation. Besides, I'm sure you have insurance that will cover the loss if it's really that important to you. The assumption that insurance would magically fix the devastation he had caused revealed how little Marcus understood about collectibles insurance or the irreplaceable nature of what he had stolen. Most comic book collections are underinsured because their values increase rapidly, and most collectors don't update their coverage frequently enough to reflect current market values. But even if insurance had covered the financial loss, which it wouldn't have completely, no insurance policy could replace the emotional investment and personal history that each comic represented. Marcus had destroyed 20 years of memories, research, and careful curation that could never be restored regardless of financial compensation. Insurance doesn't cover the sentimental value or the time invested in building the collection, I explained, though I could see from his expression that he had no interest in understanding the non-monetary aspects of what he had destroyed. Sentimental value? Marcus laughed, actually laughed, at the idea that my collection had meaning beyond money. Danielle, they're comic books. They don't have sentimental value. They're mass-produced entertainment that you got way too attached to. The cruelty of dismissing 20 years of passion as inappropriate attachment was devastating, but it was also clarifying. Marcus wasn't just a thief. He was someone who took pleasure in destroying what other people valued, especially when those values didn't align with his narrow definition of acceptable adult interests. Have you ever sat at a dinner table surrounded by people who were celebrating someone who had devastated your life? That's exactly what I experienced as my family spent the remainder of that Sunday dinner praising Marcus for his improved responsibility and mature handling of his financial problems, while treating me like a troublemaker for not joining their celebration. As I drove home that evening, I realized that my family's betrayal was actually liberating in an unexpected way. Their refusal to acknowledge Marcus's crime or support me during this crisis had freed me from any obligation to protect them from the legal consequences that Marcus would soon be facing. If they wanted to celebrate theft and dismiss my loss, they could also experience what happened when theft was prosecuted to the full extent of the law. What none of them understood was that my expertise in comic book collecting had connected me to a network of legal professionals, insurance investigators, and law enforcement specialists who understood the seriousness of collectibles theft and the federal laws that protected collectors from exactly the kind of crime Marcus had committed against me. The legal revenge that was about to unfold would teach my family that comic books might be just magazines to them, but they were valuable property under the law, and stealing valuable property had consequences that no amount of family loyalty could prevent or minimize. While my family continued to dismiss my loss and celebrate Marcus's theft as responsible debt management, I was quietly working with specialized legal professionals who understood both the value of what had been stolen from me and the serious federal crimes that Marcus had committed in the process. My 20 years of involvement in the comic book collecting community had connected me with attorneys, investigators, and experts who regularly handled cases involving theft of valuable collectibles. 3 days after that devastating Sunday dinner where my family had celebrated Marcus's crime, I met with Catherine Williams, an attorney who specialized in art and collectibles theft. Catherine's practice focused on recovering stolen cultural property, and she had extensive experience with cases involving family members who stole valuable collections from relatives, while assuming that family relationships would protect them from legal consequences. Ms. Turner, Catherine said as we reviewed the documentation I had brought to our initial consultation, what your brother did constitutes multiple serious felonies under both state and federal law. The value of your collection puts this case into categories that carry mandatory minimum sentences in federal jurisdiction. The legal reality that Marcus faced was far more serious than anything my family had considered when they dismissed his theft as a family matter that could be resolved through forgiveness and understanding. Theft of property, valued over $100,000, triggered federal jurisdiction, and organized theft of collectibles often involved interstate commerce laws that added additional charges and penalties. Catherine explained that my meticulous documentation of my collection, including purchase receipts, authentication certificates, grading reports, and photographs, provided exceptional evidence for both criminal prosecution and civil recovery. Most collectibles theft cases struggled with proving ownership and value, but my 20 years of careful record-keeping had created an airtight case that would be almost impossible for Marcus to defend against. Your documentation is extraordinary, Catherine noted as she examined my detailed inventory records. Most collectors don't maintain this level of detail, which makes prosecution difficult. But you have provenance records, condition reports, and expert valuations that establish clear ownership and value for every item in your collection. The professional authentication and grading services I had used throughout my collecting years had created a paper trail that proved not only what I had owned, but exactly when I had acquired each item and what its condition had been. This documentation would make it impossible for Marcus to claim that he had legitimate rights to sell my property or that the items were worth less than I claimed. But the legal case was about more than just recovering money. It was about establishing that collectibles theft carried the same serious consequences as any other major property crime. Catherine explained that prosecutors in our jurisdiction had been looking for high-profile cases to send messages about cultural property crimes and deter other potential thieves who assumed that art and collectibles were safe targets. The district attorney's office has indicated that they want to prosecute this case aggressively, Catherine informed me. They see collectibles theft as a growing problem, and they want to demonstrate that stealing art, comics, or other cultural property will result in serious prison time. While Catherine prepared the criminal case, I also worked with David Chen, a private investigator who specialized in tracking stolen collectibles and identifying the buyers who had purchased property from thieves. David's expertise in comic book markets and dealer networks would be crucial in documenting exactly where Marcus had sold my comics and for how much money. Your brother was remarkably sloppy in his disposal of your collection, David observed after conducting initial interviews with local comic book dealers. He sold high-value items to multiple dealers over a 3-day period, and several dealers have expressed concern about the legitimacy of the transactions. The investigation revealed that Marcus had indeed sold my comics for far less than their actual value, focused more on quick cash conversion than maximizing the money he received. Several dealers had been suspicious of someone offering multiple high-value comics simultaneously, especially when the seller couldn't answer basic questions about the item's history or significance. One dealer told me that your brother seemed to have no knowledge about the comics he was selling, David continued. When asked about the condition and provenance of a $50,000 comic, your brother said it was just an old book that he needed to get rid of quickly. The evidence from dealers would be crucial in establishing that Marcus knew he was selling stolen property and that he had deliberately chosen quick sales over legitimate market transactions. His behavior and statements during the sales process demonstrated consciousness of guilt that would support criminal charges. But the investigation also revealed something that made Marcus's crime even more infuriating. He had sold some of my most valuable comics to out-of-state dealers and collectors, which meant that recovering the actual items would be nearly impossible even after successful prosecution. My collection wasn't just stolen. It was scattered across the country and potentially lost forever. I'm afraid that physical recovery of most items is unlikely, David explained. Your brother sold to dealers in 5 different states, and many of those dealers have already resold the items to their own customers. We're looking at a situation where monetary recovery through criminal restitution and civil damages will be the primary remedy. The permanent loss of irreplaceable items added another dimension to the emotional devastation I was experiencing. Even if Marcus faced serious legal consequences for his theft, I would never again see most of the comics that had taken me 20 years to collect and preserve. But David's investigation had also uncovered evidence that would make Marcus's legal situation much worse than simple theft charges. Bank records showed that Marcus had used some of the proceeds from selling my comics to fund his Las Vegas gambling trip, and casino records would prove that he had lost thousands of dollars immediately after converting my property into cash. Using stolen property proceeds to fund gambling creates additional charges related to money laundering and organized criminal activity, Catherine explained when we reviewed David's findings. Your brother isn't just facing theft charges. He's facing federal charges that carry sentences of 10 to 20 years. The federal investigation had also attracted the attention of the FBI's art crime team, which specialized in recovering stolen cultural property and prosecuting thieves who targeted collectors and museums. Agent Sarah Martinez had been assigned to my case and was coordinating with local prosecutors to ensure that Marcus faced the full range of federal charges available for his crimes. Ms. Turner, Agent Martinez said during our interview, your case represents exactly the kind of cultural property crime that our team was created to address. Your brother didn't just steal valuable items. He destroyed 20 years of cultural preservation and collecting expertise that benefited the entire comic book community. The federal perspective on Marcus's crime was gratifying because it recognized that my collection had value beyond just personal property. It represented cultural preservation and expertise that benefited researchers, fans, and future generations of comic book enthusiasts. Marcus had destroyed something that was important to the entire community, not just to me personally. Have you ever had professionals validate the importance of something that your family dismissed as worthless? That's exactly what I experienced as federal agents, attorneys, and investigators recognized my collection as culturally significant property that deserved the full protection of the law. The legal team that was building the case against Marcus had also identified civil recovery options that would ensure I received compensation far beyond just the value of the stolen comics. Marcus would be liable for legal fees, investigation costs, emotional distress damages, and punitive damages that reflected the malicious nature of his theft. We're seeking damages of approximately $1. $2 million in the civil case, Catherine explained, which includes the value of your collection plus consequential damages, legal costs, and punitive damages for the intentional and malicious nature of the theft. The civil case would proceed independently of the criminal prosecution, ensuring that Marcus faced both prison time and financial consequences that would affect him for the rest of his life. Even if he served his prison sentence and was eventually released, the civil judgment would follow him indefinitely and ensure that he was financially responsible for the full cost of his crimes. But the most satisfying aspect of the legal strategy was that it would unfold publicly during one of Marcus's celebrations of his improved financial situation. Catherine and Agent Martinez had coordinated to serve criminal and civil papers during Marcus's upcoming birthday party, where he would be surrounded by family and friends who had praised his responsible approach to solving his gambling debts. The birthday party that would become Marcus's worst nightmare was now just 2 weeks away, and everything was in place to transform his celebration into the beginning of the most serious legal consequences he had ever faced. The coordination between federal agents, local prosecutors, and my legal team reached its culmination on the evening of Marcus's 34th birthday party, an event that my parents had planned as a celebration of his financial turnaround and mature approach to solving his problems. The irony of celebrating theft and gambling addiction as financial responsibility was about to become devastatingly clear to everyone who had supported Marcus's crime against me. The party was held at my parents' house, with approximately 50 guests, including extended family, neighbors, and friends who had been told that Marcus had successfully addressed his financial problems through hard work and responsible decision-making. The guest list included aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends who had watched Marcus struggle with gambling addiction for years and were supposedly celebrating his recovery and stability. I had been invited to the party, though my parents made it clear that they hoped I would put aside my feelings about the comic book situation and join the family in celebrating Marcus's positive changes. The expectation that I should celebrate the person who had stolen my life's work, while my family praised him for that theft, was both insulting and revealing about how completely they had normalized his criminal behavior. I declined to attend the party as a guest, but I was definitely planning to be there when federal agents arrived to serve the multiple felony warrants that had been issued for Marcus's arrest. Agent Martinez had coordinated the timing to ensure maximum impact and to demonstrate that federal law enforcement took cultural property crimes seriously, regardless of family relationships. At 8:30 p.m., just as the party was reaching its peak with toasts to Marcus's improved responsibility and successful problem-solving, 3 black SUVs with federal plates pulled up to my parents' house. Agent Martinez led a team of 6 federal agents and local detectives who were prepared to execute arrest warrants, search warrants, and to begin the process of asset forfeiture that would recover whatever remained of the money Marcus had received from selling my stolen comics. I watched from across the street as federal agents approached the front door, knowing that the next few minutes would permanently change my family's understanding of the consequences for theft and their celebration of criminal behavior. The birthday party that was supposed to honor Marcus's maturity was about to become a demonstration of how federal law enforcement handles major property crimes. The front door of my parents' house opened to reveal my father, who was clearly expecting late-arriving party guests rather than federal agents with arrest warrants. His expression shifted from welcoming host to shocked confusion as Agent Martinez displayed her FBI credentials and announced the purpose of their visit. "Good evening, sir. I'm Special Agent Martinez with the FBI Art Crime Team. We have federal arrest warrants for Marcus Bennett and search warrants for this premises in connection with theft of cultural property valued at over $650,000. The formal announcement carried clearly into the house, where the party conversation stopped immediately as guests realized that federal agents were at the door. I could see people gathering near windows and doorways, trying to understand what was happening and why FBI agents were interrupting Marcus's birthday celebration. My father's shocked response was audible from across the street. "There must be some mistake. This is my son's birthday party. We haven't done anything wrong. My son Marcus has been working hard to improve his financial situation. Sir, we need to speak with Marcus Bennett immediately, Agent Martinez replied in her professional law enforcement tone. We have evidence that he committed federal crimes involving the theft and interstate sale of valuable collectibles. Please ask him to come to the door. The mention of federal crimes and interstate sale caused visible panic among the party guests who could hear the conversation. People began gathering their belongings and moving toward exits, clearly understanding that they were witnessing the beginning of a serious legal proceeding, rather than experiencing a minor misunderstanding. Marcus appeared at the door within moments, his birthday party confidence immediately replaced by the pale, panicked expression of someone who realized that his crimes had caught up with him. He was wearing an expensive new suit that had likely been purchased with money from my stolen comics, and his attempt to appear calm and innocent was undermined by his obvious terror at seeing federal agents. Marcus Bennett, Agent Martinez said, reading from the warrant. You are under arrest for federal charges including theft of cultural property, interstate transportation of stolen goods, money laundering, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The formal reading of federal charges caused chaos among the party guests, who were now witnessing the arrest of the person they had been celebrating for his responsible financial behavior. The crimes being described, theft, interstate transportation of stolen goods, money laundering, were serious federal felonies that could result in decades in prison. Marcus's response to being handcuffed was exactly what I had expected based on his character. He immediately tried to blame me for his legal problems. This is ridiculous, he shouted as federal agents secured him in custody. My sister is just mad that I sold some old comic books. This isn't a federal crime, it's a family disagreement. Sir, Agent Martinez replied calmly, theft of property valued at over $650,000 with interstate commerce implications is absolutely a federal crime. Your relationship to the victim doesn't change the criminal nature of your actions. The professional correction of Marcus's attempt to minimize his crimes provided clear education for the party guests about the seriousness of what he had done. These weren't old comic books involved in a family disagreement. They were valuable cultural property that had been stolen and sold across state lines in violation of federal law. My mother's reaction was to immediately blame me for Marcus's arrest rather than acknowledging his criminal behavior. Danielle, how could you do this to your own family? She screamed toward the federal agents as if I were present. He's your brother. These are just comic books. You're destroying our family over material possessions. Agent Martinez's response was professionally devastating. Ma'am, your son committed serious federal crimes that carry mandatory prison sentences. The value and nature of the stolen property, combined with interstate sales activity, created federal jurisdiction, regardless of family relationships. The party guests were witnessing a real-time education about federal law enforcement and the seriousness of cultural property crimes. Many of them were clearly shocked to learn that comic book theft could result in federal charges and mandatory prison sentences. But the arrests were only the beginning of the legal consequences that Marcus and my family would face. Other agents were executing search warrants throughout the house, documenting Marcus's lifestyle and seizing evidence related to his crimes. We have evidence that the defendant used proceeds from stolen property to fund gambling activities and luxury purchases, Agent Martinez announced to the crowd. Additional charges related to money laundering and organized criminal activity may be filed based on our investigation. The revelation that Marcus had used my stolen comics to fund gambling trips added another layer of federal charges that could significantly increase his prison sentence. The party guests were learning that what my family had celebrated as responsible problem-solving was actually an organized criminal enterprise involving multiple federal violations. Have you ever watched someone's crimes catch up with them in front of everyone who had been praising their criminal behavior? That's exactly what I witnessed as federal agents arrested Marcus during his birthday celebration, while his supporters learned the truth about his financial turnaround. The search warrant execution also revealed additional evidence of Marcus's crimes, including bank records showing large cash deposits that corresponded to the sale of my comics, casino receipts from his Las Vegas gambling trip, and receipts for expensive purchases that had been funded with stolen property proceeds. as Marcus was led to a federal vehicle in handcuffs, surrounded by party guests who were now understanding that they had been celebrating a federal criminal. I felt the first sense of justice I had experienced since discovering my empty storage room. The legal system was working exactly as it should, treating cultural property theft as the serious crime it is, regardless of family relationships or social dynamics. The birthday party that was supposed to celebrate Marcus's maturity and responsibility had become a public demonstration of federal law enforcement's commitment to prosecuting cultural property crimes. The guests who had praised his smart financial planning were now witnesses to his arrest for federal felonies that would result in years in prison. But the arrests were only the beginning of the legal process that would ultimately deliver complete justice for Marcus's theft of my life's work and my family's celebration of that theft. The months following Marcus's arrest and the dramatic end of his birthday party unfolded with a precision and completeness that exceeded even my expectations for justice and accountability. The federal prosecution of his crimes proceeded swiftly and comprehensively, with every aspect of his theft and money laundering activities documented and presented to a grand jury that had no difficulty returning indictments on multiple felony charges. The evidence that federal agents and my legal team had gathered was overwhelming and undeniable. Bank records showed exactly when and where Marcus had deposited large cash amounts corresponding to the sale of my comics. Dealer interviews provided detailed accounts of his suspicious behavior, an obvious lack of knowledge about the valuable items he was selling. Casino records from Las Vegas proved that he had used stolen property proceeds to fund gambling activities within days of committing the theft. Most damaging of all were the recorded conversations, where Marcus had admitted to taking my comics without permission and had laughed about my distress over losing 20 years of collecting. His own words provided clear evidence of criminal intent and consciousness of guilt that made any defense strategy impossible. The defendant's recorded statements provide unambiguous evidence of deliberate theft and callous disregard for the victim's rights, federal prosecutor Amanda Richardson explained during a press conference about the case. This prosecution sends a clear message that cultural property crimes carry serious consequences regardless of family relationships. The federal grand jury returned indictments charging Marcus with theft of cultural property, interstate transportation of stolen goods, money laundering, and conspiracy. The charges carried potential sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years in federal prison, with mandatory minimum sentences that prevented plea negotiations below certain thresholds. Marcus's attempts to minimize his crimes and blame me for his legal problems failed completely when confronted with the overwhelming evidence of his organized criminal activity. His initial claims that he had simply borrowed family property were destroyed by evidence showing systematic theft, interstate sales, and immediate conversion of proceeds into gambling and luxury purchases. "Your Honor," Marcus's court-appointed attorney said during the arraignment, "my client acknowledges that he made poor decisions regarding his sister's property, but he believed he had family permission to liquidate assets during a financial emergency." The attempted defense was immediately demolished by Prosecutor Richardson, who presented recordings of Marcus laughing about my distress and explicitly stating that he had taken my comics without permission because I wouldn't have agreed to help him voluntarily. The defendant's own recorded statements prove that he knew he was committing theft, Richardson told the court. He explicitly admitted that he took the victim's property without permission and that he deliberately concealed his actions while the victim was out of town. The recordings also proved that Marcus had understood the value of what he was stealing, contradicting his attempts to claim that he had thought the comics were worthless. His statements about getting good money and his knowledge of specific items' values demonstrated that his theft was calculated and informed rather than impulsive or mistaken. Marcus's federal conviction occurred 8 months after his arrest, with guilty verdicts on all charges following a 3-day trial, where the evidence was so overwhelming that the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The conviction carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 12 years in federal prison, plus full restitution and asset forfeiture of all remaining stolen property proceeds. But the criminal conviction was only part of the justice I received for Marcus's theft and my family's betrayal. The civil lawsuit that Catherine Williams had filed proceeded independently and resulted in a judgment that went far beyond simple recovery of my collection's value. The civil jury awarded damages totaling $1. $4 million, Catherine informed me after the verdict was announced. This includes the value of your collection, consequential damages for the irreplaceable nature of the items, punitive damages for the malicious nature of the theft, and attorney's fees for the entire legal process. The $1.4 million civil judgment recognized that Marcus's crimes had caused damages far beyond the monetary value of my stolen comics. The jury understood that 20 years of collecting expertise and passion couldn't be replaced simply by receiving money, and they awarded damages that reflected the comprehensive nature of my loss. More importantly, the civil judgment was structured to ensure that Marcus would be financially responsible for his crimes for the rest of his life. Even after serving his 12-year prison sentence, he would face wage garnishment and asset seizure until the full judgment was satisfied, creating permanent consequences that would affect him for decades. The asset forfeiture process also revealed additional crimes that Marcus had committed while spending the proceeds from my stolen comics. Federal agents traced luxury purchases, gambling expenditures, and cash transactions that had been funded with stolen property, adding to both the criminal charges and the civil damages he faced. The defendant used stolen property proceeds to purchase a luxury watch, designer clothing, and to fund multiple gambling trips to Las Vegas. Agent Martinez testified during the sentencing hearing. This pattern of behavior demonstrates organized criminal activity rather than impulsive theft during a financial emergency. Marcus's sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for me to address the court and explain the full impact of his crimes on my life and passion. For the first time since the theft, I was able to speak in a forum where my loss was recognized as serious and worthy of protection, rather than dismissed as attachment to material possessions. Your Honor, I told the court, what Marcus stole wasn't just valuable property. It was 20 years of passion, research, and dedication that connected me to a community of collectors and enthusiasts who preserve important cultural artifacts. He destroyed something that could never be rebuilt, regardless of financial compensation. The federal judge's response was everything I had hoped for in terms of recognition and validation. Mr. Bennett, you committed serious crimes against someone who trusted you, and you destroyed something that represented decades of dedication and expertise. Cultural property crimes attack the foundations of preservation and collecting that benefit entire communities, not just individual victims. Marcus received the maximum sentence allowed under federal guidelines, 15 years in federal prison plus 3 years of supervised release, during which he would be prohibited from gambling, required to make restitution payments, and subject to financial monitoring that would prevent future crimes. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of Marcus's conviction was that it completely vindicated my decision to pursue legal justice, rather than accepting my family's pressure to forgive and forget his crimes. The federal court system had recognized the seriousness of what he had done and delivered consequences proportionate to the magnitude of his theft and betrayal. My parents and extended family, who had celebrated Marcus's theft and defended his actions, were forced to confront the reality that what they had characterized as family cooperation was actually organized federal criminal activity. The news coverage of Marcus's conviction and 15-year sentence made it clear that their support for his crimes had been morally and legally wrong. Local man, sentenced to 15 years for theft of sister's comic collection, was the headline that appeared in our local newspaper, along with details about the federal prosecution and the value of the stolen cultural property. The article made it impossible for anyone in our community to continue believing that Marcus's actions had been acceptable or justified. But the financial recovery from Marcus's conviction allowed me to do something that was even more meaningful than simply replacing my lost collection. I used the civil judgment proceeds to start my own business as a comic book authentication and appraisal specialist, turning my expertise and passion into a professional service that helped other collectors protect their own investments. Turner Comics Authentication became a nationally recognized business that provided expert grading, authentication, and valuation services for comic book collectors, dealers, and investors. My experience with theft and recovery had given me unique insights into the legal and practical aspects of protecting valuable collections, and my 20 years of collecting expertise provided the knowledge base necessary to help others avoid the kind of loss I had experienced. Ms. Turner's authentication services are considered the gold standard in our industry, Comic Book Weekly wrote in a feature article about my business. Her expertise in identifying counterfeits assessing condition, and providing legal documentation for collections has protected millions of dollars in collector investments. The business success that grew from the ashes of Marcus's theft was more satisfying than simply recovering money could ever have been. I had transformed my loss into expertise that helped other collectors protect their passion and investments from both external thieves and family members who might not understand or respect the value of collecting. Have you ever turned your worst experience into something that helped other people avoid similar trauma? That's exactly what happened as my business grew, and I became recognized as a leading expert in comic book authentication and collectors' rights protection. 5 years after Marcus's conviction, Turner Comics Authentication had grown into a thriving business with clients throughout the United States and international recognition for excellence in comic book evaluation and protection. The theft that was supposed to destroy my passion had actually launched a career that allowed me to share my expertise while helping thousands of collectors protect their own investments and passion. Marcus was serving his 15-year sentence at a federal correctional facility in Arizona, where he would remain until 2039. The civil judgment continued to accrue interest, ensuring that his financial responsibility for his crimes would extend far beyond his prison release. Every month, a portion of any money he earned in prison was garnished to pay toward the judgment that would follow him for the rest of his life. My parents' relationship with me had evolved significantly as they came to understand the seriousness of Marcus's crimes and the appropriateness of his punishment. The federal conviction had forced them to confront the reality that what they had celebrated as responsible debt management was actually organized criminal activity that deserved serious legal consequences. "Danielle, we owe you an apology," my mother said during a conversation we had 3 years after Marcus's conviction. "We didn't understand how serious what Marcus did was, and we didn't realize how much your collection meant to you. We should have supported you instead of defending him." The apology was meaningful, but it couldn't undo the emotional damage caused by their initial betrayal and dismissal of my loss. Our relationship would never be the same, but it had stabilized around mutual respect and understanding, rather than the dysfunctional dynamics that had enabled Marcus's criminal behavior. The comic book collecting community had also embraced my story as an important example of how legal systems can protect collectors from theft, and how expertise and documentation are crucial for successful prosecution of cultural property crimes. I was invited to speak at conventions, write articles for collecting magazines, and provide expert testimony in other cases involving stolen comic books and collectibles. "Danielle Turner's case changed how law enforcement views comic book theft," said Detective Maria Santos, who specialized in art and collectibles crimes. Her documentation and expertise proved that these cases can be prosecuted successfully, and her business helps other collectors protect themselves from similar crimes. Today, Turner Comics Authentication maintains offices in 3 cities and employs 12 specialists who provide authentication, grading, and legal protection services for collectors worldwide. The business that grew from my devastating loss has become more successful and meaningful than my original collection could ever have been. But perhaps the most important outcome of my experience with theft and justice was the personal growth that came from standing up to family pressure and pursuing legal consequences, rather than accepting victimization. I learned that protecting your passion and achievements sometimes requires making difficult decisions that others won't understand or support. If you're dealing with family members who don't respect your achievements, passions, or property rights, please know that you have legal options that exist regardless of family relationships. Theft is theft, whether it's committed by strangers or relatives, and you don't have to accept criminal behavior just because someone shares your DNA. The law exists to protect people like us, collectors, artists, creators, and enthusiasts who build something meaningful through dedication and expertise. When someone destroys that work, legal consequences are not only appropriate, but necessary to protect the broader community of people who create value through passion and commitment. Marcus's theft taught me that some family relationships are toxic and destructive, but it also taught me that justice systems can work when you have evidence, expertise, and the courage to pursue legal remedies rather than accepting abuse. The collection he destroyed was replaced by something even better: a business that helps other collectors protect their passion while establishing my expertise as a recognized authority in comic book authentication and preservation. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share your experiences in the comments below. Have you ever had family members steal or destroy something you worked years to build? How did you handle situations where relatives dismissed your passions as worthless while simultaneously exploiting them? Your story might help someone else who's dealing with similar betrayal and theft. Thank you for joining me on this journey from devastating loss to legal justice to professional success. Remember that your passions and achievements are worth protecting, even when the people closest to you don't understand or value what you've built. Sometimes the greatest revenge is turning your worst experience into expertise that helps others while proving that dedication and commitment ultimately create value that no one can truly destroy. See you in our next story here on Her Sweet Revenge.